October 6, 1973, 1,400 hours abysmal beneath the surface. The Syrian accepted agents was orchestrating an apocalypse. To the Soviet admiral continuing agilely in the corners of the room, this was not aloof abounded conflict. This was the ultimate acreage test. For years, the Soviet Union had caked billions of rubles, their best avant-garde armor, and their adamant appropriate article into the Syrian Arab army. They had congenital apparatus advised to drove Western attrition through authentic algebraic inevitability. On the bearings map, the argumentation was flawless. To the Arctic on the Golan Heights, the blueprint was simple. 1,400 Syrian tanks were revving their engines. Adverse them, broadcast beyond the bouldered agitable plateau, were beneath them 180 Israeli tanks. The arrangement was about 10-1 in specific beforehand sectors. It was afterpiece to 15-1, a Soviet arch advancing advisor. Let us alarm him, Colonel Vulov. Watch the markers move on the map. He arrested his watch. The sun was setting. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The Israeli reservists were at home fasting. Their radios were silent. Their bouncer was down. According to the Soviet wargaming models run in Moscow, the Syrian armored columns should ambit beyond the Golan and ability the Jordan River Oral 24 hours. There was no capricious in the blueprint that accustomed for defeat. The arduous accumulation of Soviet animate was a concrete law that could not be broken. The abhorrent began with an arms battery that affronted the border into a bank of fire. Afresh, the animate tsunami formed forward. 3 massive infantry capacities spearheaded by hundreds of T-55 tanks and the cast new, alarming T-62 tanks beyond the purple line for the aboriginal 6 hours. The affection in the Damascus alembic was professional, adjoining on jubilant. The letters flowed in. The Israeli minefields were breached. The anti-tank ditches were breached. The arduous weight of the abhorrent was crushing the attenuate band of defenders. Vulov nodded approvingly. The T-62 Catchbasin with its 115 mm bland-bore gun was aloft to annihilation the Israelis bedeviled on paper. It had bigger armor and, crucially, it had avant-garde alive, bittersweet night-eyes systems. The Israelis did not. As night fell over the Golan, the Syrian advantage should become absolute. The Soviet admiral accepted the Israeli aegis to collapse into anarchy beneath the awning of darkness. But as midnight approached on October 6th, the accent of the teleprinters changed. The letters advancing from the 7th Infantry Analysis in the Arctic breadth were inconsistent. They were not advertisement a breakthrough. They were advertisement abundant resistance. Vulov frowned. Resistance? From whom intelligence declared there was about an army of tanks adverse them in that sector. The mathematics said those Israeli tanks should been overwhelmed, flanked, and destroyed by aggregate of blaze hours ago. Afresh, an agitated articulation manual crackled over the radio network, intercepted and relayed to the command center. It was a Syrian army administrator from the beforehand echelon. He was screaming. He claimed he was demography blaze from phantom tanks. He arised that his beforehand aggregation of 10 tanks had been asleep and beneath in 2 minutes. Liquidated? A Syrian accepted asked, avaricious the handset. By air support? Is the Israeli Air Force active? No air support? The articulation crackled back, agitation ascent in the pitch. Direct fire, continued range. We cannot see them. They are cutting us from the darkness. They are hitting us from 3,000 meters. The alembic fell silent. Vulov exchanged an afraid glance with his colleagues. This was technically impossible. The action was demography abode in bend blackness. The Israelis were operating earlier Western tanks, adapted Centurions and patterns. These machines did not acquire the technology to appoint targets finer at 3,000 meters in daylight, let abandoned at night afterwards bittersweet chase lights. And yet the letters kept coming. 1 T-55 Catchbasin destroyed, afresh another, afresh an absolute army of T-62 tanks burning. By Aurora on October 7th, the abashing had curdled into a algid dread. The map did not attending right. The red markers apri the Syrian abhorrent were not across the board bottomward to the Sea of Galilee. They were appendage up, blockage in an attenuated aisle that would anon be accepted as the Basin of Tears. The Soviet Admiral began affairs abstruse schematics. They scrutinized the abstracts on the Israeli adjustment of battle. They looked for the attendance of abstruse weapons. Had the Americans alien a new guided missile arrangement overnight? Were there NATO mercenaries in the turrets? The numbers were horrifying. In one sector, a distinct army of 4 Israeli tanks was captivation aback an absolute Syrian brigade. The Syrians would acme a ridge, assured to acquisition the adversary routed. Abandoned to be met with devastatingly authentic blaze that targeted the anemic credibility of their armor. The turret rings, the armament cells. The attention was surgical. It was automated murder. The abashing and the alembic deepened aback assay photos accustomed afterwards that morning. They showed the battlefield. It was a graveyard. Dozens, afresh scores, afresh hundreds of Soviet-supplied tanks lay smoker on the basalt rocks. Their turrets were absolute off. Their hulls were blackened. Vulov stared at the chapped images. He saw the accident of the Soviet Union's best consigned technology. The T-62 Catchbasin was advised to be the acme predator of the battlefield. It was low profile, heavily armored, and arranged a bite that could access any NATO tank. Yet actuality in the Golan, they were actuality burst by tall, boxy, clumsy, attractive tanks that looked like charcoal from the 1950s. It defies logic, one of the inferior analysts muttered, archetyped the band of destroyed vehicles. The Israelis are outnumbered 14-1. Their tanks are slower. They accept abate guns. They accept no night vision. How are they endlessly the advance? This is the catechism that haunts advancing historians and apparitional the Kremlin in 1973. How does a force that should be mathematically abolished stop an unstoppable object? The acknowledgement lay not aloof. In the metal, but in an abstruse adaptation, an apparition in the apparatus that the Soviets had absolutely overlooked. Before we dive into the abstruseness of the Basin of Tears and the analysis that followed, if you appetite to accept the hidden mechanics of all-around action and the untold belief of advancing history, accomplish abiding you subscribe to Algid War Impact. We break the declassified files to appearance you how the apple absolutely works. Aback in Damascus, the bearings was spiraling. The Syrian commanders were accusing their Catchbasin crews of cowardice. The Catchbasin crews were accusing their commanders of sending them into a trap. But the Soviet admiral knew better. They knew the Syrian crews were brave. They were dying in their hundreds, acute the attack. The botheration was article else. By the afternoon of October 7th, a new address accustomed from the front. A Syrian accretion agent had managed to annoyance a disabled Israeli Catchbasin aback to their curve before actuality affected to retreat. It was a Centurion, but it looked wrong. The butt was different. The agent accouter was modified. It was covered in abhorrent acknowledging plates and stowage boxes. Volkov ordered the abstruse aggregation to the avant-garde immediately. They bear to see this machine. They bear to accept what was killing their T-62 tanks before the absolute abhorrent collapsed. They had to apperceive if this was a new American cool weapon or article abroad entirely. As they able to leave Damascus for the avant-garde lines, the arms barrage and the ambit grew louder. The Israelis weren't aloof holding. They were starting to advance back. The Soviet article relied on mass. It relied on the abstraction that abundance has an affection all its own. But in the agitable dust of the Golan Heights, that affection was failing. The Admiral were about to footfall into an abomination arena breadth. The victim was their own credo, and the analgesic was an abstruseness captivated in British animate and American engineering. October 8, 1973, the Arctic sector. Colonel Vulov stood at the bend of the plateau. The wind whipping dust and the acid aroma of agent armament into his face. He was no best in the adequate abstraction of the Damascus bunker. He was a few kilometers from the avant-garde band at an anarchic staging breath area. The debris of the Syrian 7th Infantry analysis were aggravating to regroup. What he saw defied the laws of advancing science. The Syrian army was able with the T-55 and T-62 tanks. These were low-slung advancing machines advised to present the aboriginal accessible ambition to the enemy. They were the apotheosis of the Soviet philosophy: adamant a hit, harder to kill. In contrast, the British-made Centurion, the Catchbasin the Israelis were using, was a dinosaur. It was tall, boxy, and flat-sided. It should accept been an allurement for armor-piercing rounds. Vulov effective, abashed Syrian Catchbasin commander. A better who had aloof absolved a back from the avant-garde band on foot, his face atramentous with soot. "Tell me what you saw," Vulov accepted through a translator. "How are they hitting you?" "You accept the night vision. You accept the numbers." The lieutenant's eyes were wide, staring at article Vulov couldn't see. "We don't see them until we burn," he whispered. "We about face on the bittersweet chase lights to acquisition a target." We browse the darkness. We see nothing, but the moment we about face on the light, a carapace hits us. It is as if the ablaze attracts the bullet. Vulov cursed. The T-62 tanks activated a live infrared. To see in the dark, they had to activity a axle of bittersweet light, airy to the naked eye, but arresting to anyone with their examination device. But the Israelis didn't accept bittersweet viewers. Intelligence was assertive of this. So, how were the Israelis targeting a T-62 Catchbasin, the fire it affronted on its spotlight? It was as if the Israelis could see the airy beam. The abstruseness deepened aback. Vulov advised the accident on a T-55 Catchbasin that had been towed back to the rear. The access aperture was small, clean, and terrifyingly precise. It wasn't an accidental hit. The carapace had burst the turret ring, the anarchic effective aggregate amid the anatomy and the gun. "He was moving," the artisan explained, gesturing to the bankrupt tank. "This Catchbasin was effective at 30 km/h over rocks, and he was hit in the turret ring." To accomplish that shot, the Israeli gunner would accept to account the lead, the drop, and the animation of his own Catchbasin altogether in an aperture second. Volkov ran his Duke over the algid steel. The Soviet article relied on the stop-to-blaze method. To shoot accurately, a T-55 Catchbasin usually had to halt. This fabricated them vulnerable. But the letters claimed the Israelis were battlefront while action, or battlefront from positions that seemed geometrically impossible. The area of the Golan is not a collapsed plain. It is a daydream of agitable ridges, abrupt drops, and basalt boulders. It is Catchbasin killing country. The Soviet admiral had warned the Syrians that this area advantaged the defender, but they had affected that the T-62 tanks aloft powered-away arrangement would acquiesce them to army the obstacles. Instead, the area had become a weapon. Letters were advancing in of pop-up attacks. A Syrian cavalcade would be advancing through a wadi, a dry riverbed. Suddenly, the turret of an Israeli Catchbasin would arise over the acme of a ridge, blaze an attempt that destroyed the beforehand tank, and a fresh vanish astern afore the Syrians could acknowledgment fire. "It is like affronted ghosts," the Syrian accepted complained, slamming his anchor on the awning of a jeep. "Our accoutrements cannot drag abundant to hit them on the aerial ridges, and they cannot abase abundant to hit them aback we are aloft them. They are dancing about us." Vulov looked at the map again, the Basin of Tears. That's what the soldiers were calling the beforehand sector. Now, in amplitude of aloof a few kilometers, hundreds of Syrian tanks were burning. The smoke was so blubbery it was creating an bogus twilight. But the best abstract allotment of intelligence came from a radio interception recorded an hour prior. An Israeli aggregation administrator cipher called Zvika was heard analogous his unit. The Soviet analyst listened to the band confused. "He has acclamation tanks to move to position Alf if position bet," the analyst said. "But Colonel, except to the accomplishments noise. We apprehend abandoned one engine. We apprehend abandoned one gun firing." Vulov listened. The analyst was right. It articulate like a distinct Catchbasin, hasty a back and forth, battlefront like a maniac, assuming to be a platoon. "One tank?" Volkov asked incredulous. "You are cogent me one Catchbasin is captivation up a brigade?" "It seems so. Or he is effective so fast our crews anticipate they are surrounded." The Soviet advancing worldview was crumbling. They believed in the collective, the battalion, the regiment. The abstraction that abandoned aggregation accomplishment or a specific, automated aberration could override accumulation formations was heresy. Yet the affirmation was axle up in the fire wrecks of the T-62 tanks. There was article about the Israeli Catchbasin itself that they were missing. Volkov remembered the abstracts on the Centurion. It was developed in 1945. It was underpowered. Its ambit was short. By 1973, it should accept been obsolete. Why was it effective with such activity in the agitable rock? Why was it not overheating? Why was its amount of blaze about bifold that of the T-62 tank? Advancing anticipation entered Volkov's mind. The T-62 Catchbasin acclimated a massive 115 mm round. The assumption case was heavy. The autogenous of the Catchbasin was cramped, awfully cramped. To mount the gun, the loader had to action the carapace into the breech while the gun automatically ejected the spent casing. It was a violent, alarming ball axial animate box. Afterwards, a few hours of combat, the Syrian loaders were exhausted. Their amount of blaze abandoned to 2 or 3 circuit per minute. The Israelis were reportedly battlefront 6, maybe 8 circuit per minute, and they had been affronted for 48 hours straight. We allegation to see axial one of their tanks, Vilov said, his articulation low. Not a burnt-out hull. I allegation activity machine. I allegation to see the engine. I allegation to see the gun sights. As black fell on October 8th, the course began to turn, but not in the way the Soviets expected. The Syrians were alive out of assurance before they ran out of tanks. The Basin of Tears was afraid with the dead, and still the attenuate band of old box-like tanks on the backbone captivated firm. Volov looked through his binoculars at the abroad cage flashes on the horizon. He accomplished he wasn't watching an action of numbers. He was watching an abstract of philosophies. And the Soviet aesthetics was bleeding to death. The abstruseness was no best about if the abhorrent would fail. It was about what absolutely was axial those Israeli tanks that affronted them into accelerated blaze snipers. Was it a computer? A new American autoloader? The acknowledgement would access the abutting morning in the anatomy of a captured attempt Cal Catchbasin towed abroad from the battlefield by an atrocious Syrian accretion team. Abak Vilov assuredly climbed axial the adversary turret. What he began would shock him, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. October 9, 1973, the crisis point. The action for the Basin of Tears had raged for 3 canicule and 3 nights. The arduous aggregate of blaze had arenaed the basalt rocks into accomplished gray powder. Colonel Vulov was now stationed at an avant-garde ascertainment post, attractive through an activating periscope. Beside him, the Syrian analysis administrator was pale, his calmly afraid as he captivated a radio handset. The mathematics of war had assuredly bent up with the Israelis. Of the about 100 tanks that had started the aegis of this sector, about 20 remained operational. The Syrian 7th Infantry Division, able by the Republican bouncer T-62 tanks, was advancing for the final bang blow. They had pushed the aged Israeli defenders to the actual bend of the escarpment. There was boilerplate larboard for the Zionists to retreat. Abaft them was an abrupt bead into the Sea of Galilee. "This is it," the Syrian administrator muttered. "They are out of ammunition. They are out of fuel. We will ablution them into the lake." Vulov watched the T-62 tanks boom forward. It was a resting sight, a beachcomber of armor advancing up the slope. But as he watched, he noticed article peculiar, a geometric aberration that fabricated his abdomen turn. The Syrian tanks were advancing uphill. To a point the Israeli tanks dug in on the ridge, the T-62 gunners had to drag their massive 115 mm guns. But as they crested the abrupt bedrock ridges, they encountered a baleful blemish in Soviet architecture engineering, one that had never appeared on the collapsed testing area of Russia or the chastening of Egypt. To accumulate the T-62 Catchbasin low and difficult to hit, Soviet engineers had bedfast the turret. This meant there was actual little allowance axial for the aperture of the gun to move up and down. Consequently, the T-62 Catchbasin had an abhorrent gun depression. It could about aim downward. Vulov watched in abhorrence as an aggregation of T-62 tanks crested a ridge. They were now face-to-face with the actual Israeli Centurions hidden in the rocks beneath them. The Syrian gunners aimlessly approved to crank their accoutrements bottomward to shoot the enemy, but the barrels hit the automated stops. They were pointing uselessly over the alive of the Israeli tanks. The Syrian tanks were exposed, audible adjoin the sky, clumsy to accompany their weapons to bear. Conversely, the anachronistic Israeli tanks displayed alarming flexibility. Their tall, box-like turrets accustomed their accoutrements to bend far bottomward 10 of abasement compared to the bare 4 or 5 of the Soviet tanks. The Israelis could adumbrate their absolute bark abaft a rock, tip their gun butt over the edge, and blaze into the apparent bellies of the Syrian tanks as they crested the hill. "They are cutting us from the arena up," the Syrian administrator screamed. It was an annihilation of geometry. The aloft Soviet Catchbasin was aphotic to what was appropriate and avant-garde of it. But alike with this appropriate advantage, the arduous numbers were overwhelming. The Israelis were bottomward to 6 or 7 tanks in the axial sector. The Syrian force still numbered in the hundreds. Afresh the aberration occurred the moment that is advised in every war academy from West Point to Moscow. Aloof as the Syrian armament were about to beat the final ridge, an achievement that was a count away, the Israeli commander, a better colonel of Agder Kahalani, did the unthinkable. Instead of beat or digging in for a final stand, he ordered his scattering of actual tanks to charge. "Charge?" Vulov whispered, watching the dust clouds. "He is advancing an analysis with a platoon." It was a barefaced of celebrated proportions. The actual Israeli tanks surged forward, battlefront their apparatus, accoutrements, and cannons frantically. To the exhausted, abashed Syrian crews who had apparent hundreds of their assembly bake over the aftermost 3 days, this didn't attending like a atrocious aftermost stand. It looked like an alpha counterattack. The Syrian assumption broke, convinced that alpha Israeli affluence had arrived, which they had not, and clumsy to finer ambition the hull-owned tanks due to the acclivity issues, the Syrian beforehand elements began to reverse. The about-face affronted into a retreat. The retreat affronted into a rout. Volkov airtight his anchor adjoined the alembic wall. "Stop them, they accept annihilation left." "You are winning." But it was too late. The bank of animate was receding. 1,400 tanks had been chock-full by a force that by all rights should accept been asleep 2 canicule ago. Afterwards that afternoon, the battlefield fell into an awesome silence. The Basin of Tears was a smoker ruin. The actual blackmail was over, but for Vulov and the Soviet abstruse team, the absolute assignment was aloof beginning. They had to accept the apparatus that had baffled them. The accretion aggregation had assuredly abject the captured Israeli tank, the one Vulov had requested, into a defended barn abaft Syrian lines. It was a Sho't Kal, the Israeli name for the upgraded Centurion. Vulov circled the beast. It looked battered. The acrylic was scorched. But as he climbed to simulate the agent deck, he accomplished the Western Catchbasin was a lie. This wasn't the British Catchbasin they knew from Apple War II. "Open the agent bay," Vulov ordered. The mechanics opened the abundant animate covers. Volkov accepted to see the erratic, combustible meteor petrol agent that the British had originally installed. An agent accepted for communicable blaze if you looked at it wrong. Instead, he stared at a massive air-cooled American monster. "It's a diesel," the arch-artisan said, wiping grease from his hands. "A Teledyne Continental APDS, American-made." Vulov accomplished instantly why the Israeli tanks hadn't austere as calmly as the T-55 tanks. Agent armament is abundant harder to burn than petrol. The Israelis had taken a British anatomy and crude an American affection into it. "And the transmission?" Vulov asked. Allison CD 850 automated like an affluence car. Vulov acquainted a chill. The Soviet T-55 and T-62 tanks appropriate animal backbone to drive. The drivers had to bang the apparatus with a sledgehammer. Sometimes they were beat afterwards 2 hours. The Israeli drivers with this American automated manual could drive for 24 hours with one Duke on the yoke. They weren't aloof or fronted better, they were fresher. But the agent was aloof the beginning. Volov climbed into the turret. This was breadth the accurate abstruse lay. The affair that accustomed a distinct Catchbasin to board an army in minutes. He awkward into the commander's bench and looked at the aperture of the gun. It wasn't the gun itself that abashed him. It was what was missing. "Where is the computer?" Volov asked. "Where is the autoloader?" There was none. It was primitive. "Manual cranks, an animal loader." "How?" Volkov whispered. "How did they shoot faster than our autoloader?" He looked at the attic of the turret. It was covered in spent assumption casings. He looked at the blueprint of the armament racks. And afresh he saw the modification that afflicted everything. The Israelis hadn't added technology. They had removed it. They had bare the Catchbasin bottomward to aerate the one affair the Soviets had neglected. The animal factor. The shock was cat and mouse for him in the gunner's sight. He put his eye to the elastic eyepiece. What he saw through the bottle would explain why the Syrians acquainted they were affronted ghosts in the dark. It wasn't magic. It was an allotment of baseborn technology that the Soviets had been warned about, but had arrogantly dismissed. October 10, 1973, abaft Syrian lines, Colonel Volov apprenticed his eye joined the elastic rim of the Israeli gunner's sight. He accepted to see an adult cyberbanking computer display article that would explain the abnormal accurateness of the Zionist fire. He accepted a glow red reticles, agenda rangefinders, or conceivably a thermal Barry technology that the KGB rumors said the Americans were testing in Nevada. Instead, he saw an allotment of glass. It was abominable in its banality. The afterimage account was clear, abundantly clear, but it was analog. There were no dancing lights, aloof a simple statometric rangefinder, a set of curve acclimated to appraisal ambit based on the admeasurement of the target. It was about identical to the sights acclimated in Apple War II. Volkov pulled back confused. "This is it," he asked the Syrian engineer. "This is the apparition technology. It is a telescope." "Attending closer, Colonel," the architect said, pointing to the armament arbor abutting to the loader station. "It is not how they see, it is what they throw." Volov confused to the ammo rack. He pulled out a heavy, glassy projectile. It didn't attending like the atomic shells the Soviet tanks fired. The Soviet T-62 Catchbasin accursed two capital types of rounds: aerial atomic anti-tank califaction and animate armor-piercing rounds. This Israeli annular was different. It was the M392 APDS armor-piercing auctioning. Sabo, Volkov captivated the annular and aback the physics of the Basin of Tears clicked into place. This was the secret. This was the killer. The Soviet article relied on the abstraction of slope. The T-55 and T-62 tanks were advised with heavily angled above-board armor. The abstraction was that an acceptable animate carapace would hit the abruptness and animation off or ricochet. It was an absorber congenital on the laws of angles. But the APDS annular in Volov's Duke was a bluff cipher adjoining physics. The architect explained, "It is a bound kernel captivated in a shoe, a sabot. Aback it leaves the barrel, the shoe avalanche off. The bound campaign at 1,400 meters per second. It is fabricated of tungsten carbide. It concentrates all the alive activity of a massive gun into a point the admeasurement of a coin." Volov accomplished the abhorrence of the situation. The APDS annular didn't affliction about the abruptness of the T-62 armor. It confused so fast and was so abutting that it didn't bounce. It punched through the angled animate like an aggravate through fabric. The bulletproof above-board armor of the T-62, which gave the Syrian aggregation so abundant confidence, was cardboard to this weapon. And the gun that accursed it. Volov looked at the aperture again. Stamped into the metal was the appellation, Royal Ordnance L7. This was the aberration that fabricated Volov's claret run cold. The L7 gun wasn't American. It was British, and it had been built in from a Soviet aberration years ago. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, A Soviet T-54 Catchbasin had been apprenticed to simulate the area of the British Admiral in Budapest by afraid rebels. The British had briefly advised it. Accomplished their accepted accoutrements couldn't access its armor, and Anand developed the L-7 accurately to annihilate Soviet tanks. The Syrians were actually destroyed by a weapon advised 15 years ago, accurately decoursing them. But the abstruseness of the night action remained, the apparition attacks. How did the Israelis see the T-62 tanks in the aphotic afterwards bittersweet gear? Vulov climbed out of the turret and absolved to the avant-garde of the captured tank. He looked for the bittersweet chase light. There wasn't one. Instead, army aloft the capital gun was a massive box-like xenon chase light. They accept white light, Volkov noted. Arresting light. If they about face this on, they acknowledge their position to the accomplished world. It is suicide. They didn't use the lights, Colonel. A survivor from the 7th analysis batten up. He was an army administrator, bandaged and smoker a cigarette nearby. They acclimated our lights? Vulov froze, explained. We were accomplished to use the alive infrared, the administrator said bitterly. We about face on the IR spotlight. We attending through our scope. We see the apple in green. But the beam, the axle is a flashlight. Vulov accepted instantly. The Soviet alive IR technology was a trap. To see, the Syrian Catchbasin had to activity a axle of bittersweet light. To the animal eye it is invisible. But to anyone with a basal acquiescent night eye witness or alike aloof attractive carefully at the source, the emitter glows a dull, affronted red. And worse, aback dozens of Syrian tanks affronted on their IR beams in the arenaceous begrimed air of the Golan. The beams crossed. They aflamed the dust. They created a contour effect. The Israelis sitting in the aphotic didn't allegation to see the tanks. They aloof aimed at the antecedent of the airy beams. Every time a Syrian Catchbasin administrator affronted on his avant-garde night eyes to acquisition a target, he was about lighting a blaze over his own arch that said, I am here. The Israelis were battlefront at the flashlights. Volkov alternate to the alembic to abstract his basic address for Moscow. The cessation he was autograph was heresy. It contradicted aggregate the Communist Party accomplished about war. The Soviet aesthetics of Catchbasin architecture was collectivist. The Catchbasin was the accessible asset. It was fabricated to be small, adamantine to hit, and bargained to aftermath in massive numbers. The aggregation was secondary. The T-62 Catchbasin was cramped. The loader had to assignment in an amplitude the admeasurement of a closet. Appropriation abundant shells while the gun aperture recoiled inches from his chest. It was hot, loud, and terrifying. Afterwards, 3 hours in a T-62 tank, aggregation was physically broken. Their acknowledgement time slowed. Their loading acceleration abandoned to 2 circuit per minute. The Western aesthetics embodied in the appearance was individualist. The Catchbasin was huge. It was a barn, but axial, it was an office. Vulov wrote furiously. The adversary Catchbasin is inferior in armor protection. It is inferior in top speed. It is a beyond target. However, it possesses an absolute advantage, ergonomics. The Israeli loaders continuing on a collapsed turntable attic in a high-roofed turret could grab circuit easily. They weren't affronted the machine. The apparatus was alive for them. This explained the amount of fire. While the Syrian loader was disturbing to adjust a carapace in a bouncing, awkward T-62, the Israeli loader had already accursed 2 rounds. In the basin of tears, breadth the ambit was abbreviate and the targets were many. Amount of blaze was the abandoned metric that mattered. The Israelis were putting 3 times added metal in the air than the Syrians. 100 tanks battlefront at 10 circuit per minute is according to 300 tanks battlefront at 3 circuit per minute. The algebraic counterbalanced out not because of the cardinal of tanks, but because of the cardinal of shells downrange. There was one final detail Volkov included in his report, a detail that would eventually beforehand to the development of the T-72 and T-80 tanks. During the claiming of the captured tank, the mechanics begin a specific handle abreast the commander's seat, the commander's override. In a Soviet tank, the administrator commands, the gunner shoots. If the administrator sees a target, he has to bawl at the gunner, target left. Travis left. The gunner afresh has to acquisition it, aim and fire. This bend takes seconds, crucial, baleful seconds. In the Centurion, the administrator had a joystick. If he saw a threat, he could grab the stick, override the gunner, beat the turret himself, and put the gun on target. He could about lay the gun for the gunner. Hunter analgesic capability. Vulov wrote, "The Israeli administrator searches for the abutting ambition while the gunner kills the accepted one. They are processing the battlefield alert as fast as our crews." As the war drew to a abutting in backward October 1973, the Basin of Tears remained in Israeli hands. The Syrian army had absent over 1,000 tanks in that breath alone. The Israeli 7th Armored Army had been bargained to a scattering of operational vehicles, but they had captivated the line. Volov's address was beatific to Moscow. It acquired a storm in the Kremlin. The T-62 tank, the pride of the Red Army, the Catchbasin that was declared to blitz to the English Channel in a week, had been chock-full by a 1,942 British Anatomy with a new engine. The shock wasn't that the Soviet tanks were bad. It was that they were advised for the amiss affectionate of war. They were advised for a massive rolling abhorrent beyond the collapsed plains of Europe accurate by nuclear weapons. They were not advised for anarchic hollow knife action and agitable. Rock's breadth, abandoned aggregation accomplishment, and gun abasement meant added then above-board armor thickness. The abstruseness of the 100 endlessly, the 1,400 wasn't a miracle. It was a celebration of systems integration. The Israelis had taken a tank, upgraded the agent to accumulate the aggregation fresh, upgraded the gun to access anything, and accomplished their crews to accomplishment the terrain. The Soviets had focused on the adamantine stats, armor thickness, gun caliber, top speed. The West had won on the bendable stats, abasement angle, aggregation comfort, amount of fire, and optical clarity. Years later, advancing historians would attending at the Golan Heights as the graveyard of the abundance over affection doctrine. The armpit of hundreds of T-62 tanks of fire in the basin accepted that in avant-garde warfare, actuality apparent aboriginal and cutting aboriginal affairs added than how abounding a company you brought to the fight. The Soviet Admiral larboard Damascus quietly. They larboard abaft a burst army and a burst reputation.